Kofi Mensah had everything a man could want. Money, the kind that moves markets and builds cities. Success. His face stared back from every billboard in Lagos. Power. When he spoke, the most powerful men in the country leaned in to listen. But there was one thing missing. One hole in his perfect life that all his gold couldn't fill. 2 years ago, his wife, Amara, vanished. Just gone. Like a candle blown out in a storm. And today, on the hottest afternoon in Nigeria, he was about to see her again. But not in the way he ever imagined. The road was the third mainland bridge, and today, it was a parking lot of sun-baked metal and diesel fumes. The air outside was a thick, sweltering 34 degrees Celsius, but inside Kofi's armored SUV, it was a perfect, clinical chill. Beside him, Sasha Ose adjusted her designer sunglasses, her red dress shimmering like a flame. "This city is a circus," Sasha hissed, looking out at the hawkers weaving through the cars. "Can't they clear these people out?" Kofi didn't answer. He was staring at his phone, approving a $1 million mining merger. "I'm working, Sasha," he said coldly. "You're always working," she snapped back. Kofi sighed and looked out the window. He was thinking about 2 years ago, the empty bed, the silence of a home that used to be full of laughter. He pushed the thought away. "She left me for a payout," he told himself. "She didn't care." End of story. Just then, a hand tapped on the bulletproof glass. It wasn't the usual frantic beat of a beggar. It was slow. Deliberate. Kofi didn't look up. "Give them a note and move on," he told his driver. But the person didn't move. Slowly, very slowly, Kofi lifted his eyes from his phone, and his entire world stopped. Standing in the dust, a heavy basket of water sachets balanced on her head, was his wife, Amara. But that wasn't the most shocking part. She wasn't just tired, she was pregnant. Heavily, undeniably pregnant. Time seemed to stop. The roar of the Lagos traffic faded into a dull hum. Kofi couldn't breathe. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped animal. Amara didn't speak. Her face showed no emotion, just a deep, weary exhaustion. With a trembling hand, she reached into her pocket and pressed a small, cracked photograph against the glass. It was their wedding photo. The day he had promised to be her shield. She's pregnant. The thought hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. Whose baby? When? But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he saw the dirt on her skin and the shadows under her eyes. This was the woman who had shared his dreams, now selling water in the sun while he sat in a throne of ice. "Kofi." Sasha's voice broke through the fog. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Kofi couldn't speak. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Amara remained perfectly still, her eyes locked onto his through the tinted glass, waiting for him to recognize the life he had led. Wrote, "Stay tuned as you see how this high-stake drama unfolds. Don't forget to like and subscribe." The light turned green, and the heavy roar of 1,000 engines filled the air, a mechanical symphony of Lagos life demanding that the world move on. Kofi's driver shifted into gear, the SUV lurching forward an inch, but Kofi remained frozen, his palm pressed against the glass where the wedding photo had just been. "Kofi, for heaven's sake, roll up the window." Sasha snapped, waving a manicured hand in front of her face as the acrid smell of exhaust fumes invaded the pristine cabin. "The light is green. Tell the driver to go before we're stuck here for another hour. It's just some crazy woman with a scam. They do this all the time, they find old photos or fake them just to get a payout." Kofi didn't hear her. His eyes were locked on the small, barefoot boy, the one with his own eyes, who was now weaving desperately through the sea of yellow downfall buses, trying to keep up with Amara. The boy stumbled, his small hand reaching out to catch a side mirror for balance, his chest heaving with a shallow, ragged breath. He looked fragile, like a piece of glass about to shatter in the middle of a stampede. Kofi, are you listening? Sasha's voice rose to a shrill pitch. We have the gala at 8. I am not sitting in this heat while you stare at street people. Driver, go. The SUV began to roll faster, the gap between the luxury vehicle and the woman in the dust widening. Amora didn't look back. She kept her head down, the heavy basket of water sachets swaying with her every step, her pregnant form silhouetted against the harsh, orange glare of the afternoon sun. She was slipping away again. 2 years of silence were about to become a lifetime of regret. Stop the car, Kofi said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. What? No. Kofi, don't you dare. I said, stop the car. Kofi didn't wait for the driver to find a safe spot. He reached for the door handle. The child in the street had just collapsed to one knee, a fit of coughing racking his small frame as he disappeared behind a cloud of black smoke from a passing truck. In one violent motion, Kofi shoved the door open. The sound of the Lagos traffic hit him like a physical blow. The screams of Owoda, the blaring air horns, the suffocating heat. Sasha let out a scream of pure indignation as the billionaire, the man whose suit cost more than the cars surrounding them, stepped out into the oily grime of the Third Mainland Bridge. Mr. Mensah. Sir, it's not safe, his head of security yelled from the chase vehicle behind, but Kofi didn't turn around. He hit the pavement running, his polished Italian leather shoes slipping on the uneven road. He shoved past a fruit seller, ignored the shouts of "Ogre, watch out," and dove into the chaos. He had spent 10 lifetimes building an empire of steel and oil, but as he watched that small boy vanish into the crowd, he realized he was running for the only thing he had ever truly owned. Behind him, Sasha sat in the air-conditioned silence, her mouth agape, watching the most powerful man in West Africa disappear into the dust and the heat of the common people, leaving his wealth, his security, and his pride behind in the middle of the road. Kofi didn't care about the cameras. He didn't care about the merger. He only cared about the ghost who had just handed him his soul. Kofi reached her just as the traffic began to crawl forward again, a wall of yellow downfall buses and screaming horns separating them from the life he knew. He reached out, his hand trembling as he caught Amora's shoulder. She flinched, the heavy basket of water on her head swaying precariously before she lowered it to the oil-stained pavement with a grace born of necessity. The boy, small and pale beneath the layer of street dust, huddled against her side, his eyes wide with a fear that shattered whatever was left of Kofi's composure. Amora, Kofi breathed, the name tasting like ash and long-buried dreams. What is this? Why are you here? They told me you took the money. They told me you wanted a life away from the struggle of my climb. Amora didn't answer. She didn't cry or scream. Instead, she looked at him with a hollowed-out stare that made his billions feel like pocket change. She reached for the photograph he was still clutching, the image of their wedding day, a lifetime ago when he was just a man with a vision and she was the woman who believed in it. With a slow, deliberate motion, she turned the photo over in his hand. His eyes blurred for a second as he tried to focus on the cramped, desperate handwriting scrawled across the back. The ink was faded, smudged by sweat and perhaps tears, but the words hit him with the force of a physical execution. The son you ignored is dying because of the papers you signed. Kofi felt the word tilt. He looked from the jagged script to the boy standing at Amora's hip. The child's skin had a grayish tint, and his breathing was a thin, whistling sound that rattled in his tiny chest. Kofi knew that sound. He had heard it in the environmental reports from the Niger Delta, in the dry, clinical briefings about the unfortunate side effects of his newest mining project. The papers he had signed 3 months ago. The Project Emerald expansion. His advisors had told him the land was uninhabited, that the runoff into the local water table was within acceptable margins for a settlement of that size. He had signed the document on a mahogany desk in a penthouse office, sipping aged whiskey, never once looking at the maps of the slums that sat directly in the path of the chemical waste. He has the cough, Kofi, Amora said, her voice a ghost of the melody he used to wake up to. The water turned yellow 2 months ago. Then his hair started to thin. Then the fever came. She placed a hand on her pregnant belly, her knuckles white. I didn't come for your money. I came because you are the only one who can stop the machines. You are the only one who can give him a clean breath. A sudden, violent coughing fit seized the boy, sending him into a crouch. Kofi dropped to his knees in the dirt, ignoring the filth staining his bespoke trousers. He reached out to steady the child, and as the boy's small, hot hand gripped his thumb for support, Kofi felt the pulse of his own bloodline, weak, flickering, and poisoned by his own hand. The realization was a psychological cage. He was the wealthiest man in the room, but he was the monster under his son's bed. He had built a throne out of the very poison that was now extinguishing his legacy. Behind him, the sirens of his security detail began to wail, trying to reach him through the gridlock, but for the first time in his life, Kofi Mensah didn't want to be rescued. He wanted to be judged. Kofi's security detail finally broke through the gridlock, their black sirens cutting a path through the dust, but he waved them away with a ferocity that stunned his own men. He didn't want the tinted glass or the armored plating. He wanted the truth. He followed Amora as she led the way, the heavy basket once again balanced on her head, her gait slow and rhythmic despite the weight of her pregnancy. They moved away from the bridge, descending into a labyrinth of narrow alleys where the smell of expensive diesel was replaced by the thick, metallic tang of stagnant water and rot. The roadside shack was little more than a lean-to of rusted corrugated iron and scavenged timber, perched precariously over a slow-moving stream. As Kofi stepped inside, the heat hit him like a physical wall. There was no ventilation, only the dim lights filtering through the gaps in the metal sheets. In the corner, the boy, his son, lay on a thin mat, his breathing shallow and labored. "This is it, Kofi," Amora said, her voice devoid of bitterness, replaced by a weary finality. "This is where your gold-digger wife has been hiding." Kofi walked to the back of the shack, where a small window looked out over the water. His breath caught in his throat. Directly across the narrow ravine stood the towering grey concrete walls of the Emerald Project's primary refinery. Even from here, he could see the massive runoff pipes, the ones he had approved to save $20 million in filtration costs, spewing a thick, iridescent sludge into the stream. The water wasn't just dirty. It was an unnatural, sickly yellow, shimmering with the oily film of heavy metals. He looked down at his shoes, realizing for the first time that the mud he had marched through to get here was the same toxic silt. This wasn't just a slum, it was a catchment basin for his empire's waste. Every dollar Kofi had added to his net worth over the last quarter was a literal drop of poison in the cup Amora was using to cook their son's meal. He moved back to the boy, kneeling on the dirt floor. He reached for a plastic jug sitting near the mat, the pure water label peeling off the side. He unscrewed the cap and pulled back. The smell was unmistakable, the sharp, chemical bite of sulfuric acid and arsenic. "You didn't know," Amora whispered from the shadows. "Because you didn't look. You looked at the charts, Kofi. You looked at the profit margins. You looked at the skyscrapers. But you never looked at the water." Kofi stared at his hands. They were stained with the dust of the slum, but all he could see was the ink on the contracts. He was the most profitable man in West Africa, and he had spent the last year poisoning his own bloodline to maintain the lie that he was untouchable. The empire of poison wasn't a metaphor, it was the literal ground beneath his feet. He looked at the boy's sunken eyes and felt a cold, sharp resolve harden in his chest. The man who had walked out of that SUV was dead. The man standing in this shack was a father who had just realized he was his son's primary executioner. The shack felt smaller now, the walls of rusted iron closing in as the boy's breathing grew more ragged, a thin, whistling sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. Amora moved to the corner, her movements heavy and pained by the weight of her own pregnancy, and reached for a tattered rag to wipe the cold sweat from the child's brow. "His name is Kwame," she whispered, not looking at Kofi. "He was born 7 months after I arrived here. I named him after your father, because even when I hated you, I couldn't hate the man who raised you to be better than this." Kofi didn't move. He was staring at the boy's face, tracing the familiar arc of the brow and the stubborn set of the jaw. But it was the eyes that finally broke him. Kwame opened them for a flickering second, looking up at the stranger in the expensive suit with a clarity that felt like a trial. They weren't just the eyes of a child. They were the exact deep, amber-flecked eyes that stared back at Kofi every morning in his gold-rimmed mirror. Suddenly, the boy's body went rigid. A sharp, wet cough tore through him, and his eyes rolled back as he slumped into the thin mat. "Kwame." Amora's voice broke into a jagged sob as she dropped to her knees. Kofi acted before he could think. He shoved aside the pride that had kept him in that air-conditioned SUV and gathered the limp, burning body of his son into his arms. The boy was terrifyingly light, his ribs prominent under a thin, stained t-shirt. The smell of the toxic stream clung to his skin, the metallic, sour scent of the chemicals Kofi had personally authorized for disposal. "Get out of the way!" Kofi bellowed, his voice the one he used to command boardrooms, now raw with a father's desperation. He burst out of the shack and back into the narrow, muddy artery of the slum. His security team was waiting at the edge of the ravine, their weapons drawn, their faces masks of professional confusion. Behind them, the black SUV stood idling, their polished paint a middle finger to the filth surrounding them. "Sir, get back in the vehicle, it's a security risk," his head of guard began, reaching out to intercept him. "Touch me and you're dead," Kofi roared, stepping past him. "Clear the road. We are going to the hospital." "My hospital. Now." He climbed into the back of the lead SUV, pulling Amora in after him. He didn't care about the mud on the leather or the blood on his white shirt. He pulled Kwame close to his chest, feeling the boy's heart fluttering like a dying bird against his own. As the sirens began to wail, cutting through the Lagos evening, Kofi looked down at the boy who had spent his life begging for water while his father built an empire on the very poison that was killing him. The beggar wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a statistic. He was the heir to the Mensah legacy, and he was dying in the arms of the man who had signed his death warrant. The tires of the SUV screamed as the driver swung the vehicle onto the manicured grounds of the Mensah International Medical Center. This was Kofi's crown jewel, a gleaming monolith of glass and white marble that promised the finest care in West Africa. But as the vehicle lurched to a halt under the grand porte-cochere, the doors didn't fly open. Instead, a wall of 6 private security guards in charcoal suits stepped forward, their faces as cold and unyielding as the building behind them. Kofi shoved the door open from the inside, still cradling Kwame's limp, burning body against his chest. Amora scrambled out behind him, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and a bitter, rekindled recognition. "Sir, stay in the vehicle," the lead guard commanded, his hand raised in a flat gesture of denial. He didn't look at the dying child, his eyes were fixed on Amora with a look of practiced disgust. "We have strict orders from the board and Ms. Ose. This woman is on the persona non grata list. Under no circumstances is she, or anyone associated with her, permitted entry to this facility." "I am the board," Kofi roared, his voice cracking with a desperation he hadn't felt in decades. "Move aside. My son is dying." The guard didn't flinch. "Sir, your personal safety and the hospital's reputation are our priority. We were informed of a potential extortion attempt involving a street seller. We are to escort her off the premises immediately." Behind the glass doors, Kofi saw the hospital director watching through the window, phone pressed to his ear, refusing to make eye contact. The realization hit Kofi like a physical blow. The empire he had built was a machine designed to protect his image from his reality. Sasha and his advisors hadn't just erased Amora from his life, they had programmed his own world to reject her like a virus. Amora gripped Kofi's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "They won't let us in, Kofi. They never did. To them, we are just the dirt from the mines." Kofi looked down at Kwame. The boy's skin was beginning to take on a bluish tint, and his heartbeat was a frantic, erratic drum against Kofi's ribs. The security he had paid millions for was now the barricade between his son and a ventilator. "You have 5 seconds to step back," Kofi whispered, a terrifying stillness settling over him. It was the tone that had ended careers and swallowed competitors whole. "If you do not move, I will burn this hospital to the ground with every one of you inside it. I am Kofi Mensah, and this is my heir. Move. Now." The guard hesitated, his professional mask flickering as he saw the blood on Kofi's shirt and the raw, unhinged grief in his eyes. For a heartbeat, the power of the billionaire grappled with the protocols of the corporation. Slowly, the guard lowered his hand and stepped aside. Kofi didn't wait for an apology. He kicked the glass doors open, charging into the sterile, white light silence of the lobby, shouting for a crash cart. He was no longer the man who signed the papers. He was a father storming his own fortress to save the life he had almost helped destroy. The sterile, white light silence of the trauma bay was broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical whiz of a ventilator. Kofi stood by the glass partition, his hands pressed against the cold surface, watching the small, pale form of Kwame nearly disappear beneath a tangle of tubes and wires. Amora sat in a plastic chair nearby, her head bowed, her pregnant silhouette a stark reminder of the future that was currently hanging by a thread. The door swished open, and Dr. Arins, the hospital's top hematologist, stepped out. He didn't look at the charts in his hand, he looked at Kofi with a grim, weary intensity that made the billionaire's heart stop. "We've stabilized his breathing for now," the doctor began, his voice low. "But the underlying issue is catastrophic. The toxins in his system, arsenic and lead derivatives from the mining runoff, have triggered a rare form of aplastic anemia. His bone marrow has stopped producing healthy red blood cells. He's essentially suffocating at a cellular level." Kofi's throat went dry. "Give him whatever he needs. Money is no object. Fly in the best specialists from London or Houston. Buy the blood. Buy the whole bank." "It's not a matter of money, Mr. Mensah," Arins countered, his tone sharp with the reality of the situation. "Because of the specific chemical mutations in his blood, he has developed an extremely rare phenotype. We've checked the National Registry and our private stores. There isn't a single unit of compatible blood in the country. If we don't find a donor within the next few hours, his organs will begin to fail." Amora looked up, her eyes hollow. "I'm not a match. They already tested me. My blood is different." The doctor turned his gaze to Kofi. "There is only one person with a high enough probability of a match to bypass the cross-match delays. A direct biological relative. Specifically, the father." The silence that followed was deafening. Kofi looked through the glass at the boy who had his eyes, the boy he had spent a year pretending didn't exist. He thought of the papers he had signed, the millions he had made by cutting corners on the very safety filters that would have kept this child healthy. "Test me," Kofi whispered. "Sir, you've been under immense stress. A direct transfusion of the volume he needs is physically taxing, and your own health." "I don't care about my health." Kofi's voice cracked, echoing off the marble walls. "He is my blood. He is the only thing in this world that is actually mine. If I have to give him every drop I have, do it." 30 minutes later, Kofi lay on a gurney adjacent to his son's bed. The needle bit into his arm, a sharp, cold reminder of the connection he had tried so hard to sever. As the dark, crimson liquid began to flow through the clear plastic tubing, moving from the man who had built an empire of poison to the boy who was dying from it, Kofi felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. He watched the monitor as his own life force began to pump into Kwame's veins. For the first time in his life, the billionaire was doing something that couldn't be outsourced, leveraged, or delegated. He was finally paying the debt he owed, not with a check, but with the very thing that made them a family. He closed his eyes, listening to the synchronized beat of their heartbeats, realizing that his wealth had never been measured in gold, but in the flickering pulse of the boy in the bed beside him. The steady, rhythmic hum of the blood transfusion machine was the only sound in the darkened VIP suite until the heavy oak doors groaned open. Kofi didn't turn his head, he couldn't. His arm was still tethered to his son, his own life force creeping through the plastic line to stabilize the boy's flickering pulse. In the doorway stood Chief Kofi Mensah, Kofi's uncle and the chairman of the family council. He looked every bit the patriarch in his flowing white agbada, but to Kofi, the sight of him now felt like looking at a predator. "Kofi," the chief started, his voice a smooth, practiced velvet. "You are making a spectacle of yourself. Abandoning your car in the middle of the bridge. Bleeding out for a child from the slums. The board is already meeting to discuss your instability." "The child has my eyes, uncle," Kofi said, his voice raspy but cold. "He has my blood. And he is dying because of our minds. Why didn't anyone tell me Amara was here? Why was I told she took a bribe and vanished?" The chief walked deeper into the room, his shadow stretching across Kwame's bed like a shroud. He looked at Amara, who was standing by the window, her silhouette rigid and silent. He didn't offer an apology. He offered a justification. "She was a liability, Kofi. 2 years ago, when you were starting the Emerald Project, she began asking questions. She saw the initial survey reports, the ones we suppressed. She knew the runoff would hit the local settlements. She wanted you to stop, to spend the capital on filtration instead of expansion." Kofi felt a surge of adrenaline that made the transfusion needle ache in his vein. "So you lied to me. We saved you from yourself," the chief countered, leaning over the gunny. "You were soft back then. You were in love. If we had let her speak, the investors would have fled. We told her you had authorized the payoff. We showed her forged documents where you called her a temporary distraction. We made sure she felt so betrayed she would never want to see your face again. It was a clean extraction for the sake of the empire." Kofi looked at Amara. The 2 years of agony, the years she had spent watching their son wither away while she hawked water in the sun. It hadn't been a choice. It had been a cage built by the men he trusted most. "And the mining scandal," Kofi whispered. "The poison in the water. A necessary cost of progress," the chief said, dismissively. "Sasha knew. She helped us manage the optics. She understood that a billionaire's legacy is built on what he buries, not what he saves. Now, give the boy the blood he needs, pay the woman to disappear for real this time, and come back to the boardroom. We can still fix your image." Kofi looked at the dark red blood flowing from his arm into his son's. The empire his uncle spoke of felt like a corpse he had been dragging behind him for years. The betrayal wasn't just against Amara, it was a theft of his own humanity. He looked his uncle in the eye, and for the first time, the chief flinched. "You didn't save me, uncle," Kofi said, his voice trembling with a terrifying resolve. "You turned me into a ghost in my own life. But the ghost is awake now. And I'm going to make sure everyone sees exactly what we buried." The hum of the hospital room had changed. It was no longer a place of silent secrets, but a tactical command center. Kofi lay back on the gunny, his face ashen, the plastic tubing still tethering his vein to the forepole where his blood was being processed for Kwame. Beside him, a technician from Lagos 24 News adjusted a ring light, the glare reflecting off the sterile white tiles. "We are live in 10 seconds, Mr. Mensah," the producer whispered, her voice trembling. She knew this wasn't just an interview, it was an execution of an empire. Kofi looked at Amora. She stood by the bed, holding Kwame's small, still hand. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked at the monitor tracking their son's heartbeat, which was finally beginning to steady as Kofi's untainted cells began their work. Kofi reached out and gripped the edge of the legal document resting on his lap, the transfer of sovereign assets. 5, 4, 3. The red light on the camera flickered to life. Across Nigeria, in the bars of Victoria Island and the shacks of Mokoko, the face of the nation's untouchable titan appeared. He looked broken, his tailored shirt discarded for a simple hospital gown, his arm taped and bruised. "My name is Kofi Mensah," he began, his voice raspy but projected with a gravity that silenced the room. "For years, I told you I was building a future for this country. I spoke of progress, of wealth, and of the Emerald Project as a jewel of our economy. I was a liar." In the back of the room, Chief Osei's phone began to vibrate manically. The board was screaming, but Kofi didn't blink. "As I sit here, my own son is fighting for his life in the bed beside me. He is dying because of the water I poisoned. He is suffering because I chose a profit margin over a human soul. I signed the papers that allowed toxic runoff to flow into the homes of the people I claimed to lead. I allowed my family to erase the woman I loved to protect a stock price." He picked up a gold pen, his hand shaking slightly from the blood loss. "Effective immediately, I am resigning as CEO of Mensah International. I am signing over 100% of my personal shares, valued at $4 billion, to a blind trust. This fund will be managed by independent environmental auditors to provide immediate medical care, clean water, and relocation for every family affected by our mines. Starting with the mother of my child." He scrawled his signature across the bottom of the parchment, the ink damp and heavy. "To my shareholders, I say this, divest if you must. To my family, I say, the empire is dead. And to my son." Kofi turned his head toward the sleeping boy, tears finally tracing a path through the dust still on his cheeks. "I am sorry it took your blood to make me see mine." The feed cut to black. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the steady, healthy beep of the heart monitor. Kofi let the pen fall to the floor. He was no longer the richest man in Africa. He was a man with an empty bank account and a full heart, watching his son breathe a clean, borrowed breath for the very first time. The morning sun broke over the Lagos lagoon, casting a soft, golden light that filtered through the hospital blinds and softened the sterile white of the recovery suite. The frantic, high-stakes hum of the monitors had settled into a steady, comforting rhythm. For the first time in 48 hours, the air in the room didn't taste like ozone and fear. It tasted like a beginning. Kofi sat in a simple wooden chair pulled close to the bed, his frame looking smaller than it ever had in a boardroom. His designer suit was gone, replaced by a warm cotton shirt, and his arm bore the dark bruise of the transfusion, a mark he wore with more pride than any gold timepiece. He wasn't watching the news scrolling across the silent television, where the Mensah Empire collapse was the only headline. He didn't care that his net worth had plummeted or that the keys to the penthouse had been handed to a liquidation firm. He was watching a small, steady rise and fall of a chest that had nearly stopped moving. Kwame stirred, his eyes fluttering open. The grayish tint was gone, replaced by a faint, healthy flush of brown. He looked at Kofi, not with the terror of a street beggar watching a big man, but with a quiet, emerging curiosity. Slowly, the boy reached out a small, thin hand and wrapped his fingers around Kofi's thumb. "I'm here," Kofi whispered, his voice thick with a raw, unpolished emotion. "I'm not going anywhere, Kwame. I promise." Amora stood at the foot of the bed, her hand resting on her belly. The exhaustion was still there, etched into the lines around her eyes, but the hollow look of a woman haunted by ghosts had vanished. She looked at the man who had traded a throne for a hospital chair and, for the first time in 2 years, she didn't see the billionaire. She saw the man she had married in the dirt of their village before the gold and the oil had clouded his sight. "The lawyers called," she said softly. "The trust is active. The first relocation buses for the settlement leave this afternoon. They are calling it the Amora Foundation." Kofi didn't look up from his son. "It's a start. It doesn't fix the 2 years I stole, or the water I poisoned. But it's a start." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against his son's small hand. He had spent his life chasing more shares, more flaws, more influence. Only to find that more was a vacuum that grew larger the more he fed it. In the silence of the room, holding the hand of the boy who had survived his own father's greed, Kofi realized that he had spent decades as the richest man in West Africa while being entirely bankrupt. He had lost the empire, the SUVs, and the untouchable reputation. He had lost the perfect life that was actually a beautifully decorated cage. But as Kwame squeezed his thumb and drifted back into a deep, healing sleep, Kofi felt a weight lift that no amount of money could have bought. He wasn't a titan of industry anymore. He was just a father, finally holding the only success that mattered. And for the first time in his life, it was enough. Subscribe to this channel right now, because losing billions was never Kofi's greatest punishment. Living long enough to understand what his own signature almost took from him was.